The photograph appears innocent enough at first glance, a typical family portrait from the 1920s. But there's something deeply unusual about this image that historians have struggled to understand for decades. In the photograph, a family of 4 stands in their modest home's front room. The father, appearing to be in his late 30s, wears a simple work shirt and suspenders. The mother, roughly the same age, stands beside him in a plain cotton dress with her hair pulled back. Between them are 2 children who look to be about 8 and 10 years old. One child is white. The other is black. The white child, a girl, stands next to the mother, wearing a light-colored dress with a collar. The black child, a boy, stands next to the father, wearing knee-length pants and a button-up shirt. Both parents have their hands resting on their respective children's shoulders, the mother's hand on the white girl, the father's hand on the black boy. What makes this photograph extraordinary isn't just the racial difference between the children. It's the ordinariness of the composition. This isn't a photograph of a family with their domestic worker's child. This isn't a documentation of charitable work or adoption services. This is a family portrait, the kind that ordinary people commission to document their household, to display on their mantle, to send to relatives. The way they're positioned speaks volumes. The parents stand with equal posture, neither dominant over the other. The children are placed symmetrically, each given equal prominence in the frame. There's no visual hierarchy suggesting one child is more important than the other. They look like what they're presented as, a family unit. But in 1920 America, this shouldn't exist. This was the height of Jim Crow, when racial segregation was law across much of the country. Mixed-race families were not just socially taboo, they were often illegal under miscegenation laws. Adoption across racial lines was virtually unheard of. The idea of a white couple raising a black child, or vice versa, or any configuration that produced this kind of family portrait, defied every social norm of the era. Yet here it is. Documented. Photographed. Apparently unremarkable to the family who commissioned it. Dr. Jonathan Harris had been staring at this photograph for 3 weeks when he finally decided he needed help. As curator of American social history at the Baltimore Museum, Jonathan had encountered countless puzzling images over his 17-year career, but nothing quite like this. The photograph had arrived in a batch of materials from an estate sale in East Baltimore. No names. No dates beyond the obvious styling that placed it around 1920. No explanation. Just this image of an impossible family, documented as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Jonathan had shown it to colleagues. Everyone had theories. Maybe the black child was a servant's son, photographed with the family as a gesture of progressive kindness. Maybe this was a mixed-race family attempting to pass as white, with one child's features revealing the truth they were hiding. Maybe it was taken somewhere outside the United States, in a country with different racial dynamics. But none of these theories fit. The setting was clearly American, the furniture, the wallpaper, the clothing all matched working-class American households of the early 1920s. And if this were merely a servant's child included in a family portrait, why position him as an equal with the family's own daughter? Why have both parents touch both children in the same protective, parental way? Jonathan photographed the image with high-resolution equipment, examining every detail. The photograph measured 8 by 10 inches, mounted on thick cardboard backing that had aged to a deep cream color. The print quality suggested a professional photographer, not a casual snapshot. Someone had paid money for this portrait to be made. On the back of the photograph, written in pencil that had faded but remained legible, was a partial address, Archer Street, Baltimore, and what looked like the year, 1920, though the first digit was smudged. No names. No studio marking. No other identifying information. Jonathan began methodically researching Baltimore in 1920, searching for any Parker Street, Barker Street, or similar addresses. He found 3 possibilities, all in East Baltimore neighborhoods that in 1920 had been working-class areas with mixed immigrant populations, Irish, Italian, Jewish, and black residents living in close proximity, though usually separated by informal but rigid boundaries. He needed expertise beyond his own. Jonathan reached out to Dr. Celeste Williams, a historian at Johns Hopkins University whose work focused on race relations and family structures in early 20th century Maryland. When he described the photograph over the phone, mentioning the two children of different races, Celeste's response surprised him. "I might know what this is. Can I see it tomorrow?" Celeste arrived the following morning, and Jonathan could see the intensity in her expression as she studied the photograph he'd mounted on his office wall. She pulled out a notebook filled with handwritten research notes and began flipping through pages rapidly. "I've been documenting an unusual practice," Celeste began, her voice careful and measured. "In certain working-class neighborhoods in Baltimore, Philadelphia, and a few other industrial cities in the early 1900s, there existed informal child-sharing arrangements that crossed racial lines. They weren't adoptions in any legal sense. They weren't even spoken about openly. But they happened." She showed Jonathan her notes, interviews with elderly residents conducted in the 1990s, fragments of oral history collected from communities that had since been displaced by urban renewal. After World War I, industrial cities had serious housing shortages and economic instability. Working-class families of all races struggled. In some neighborhoods where black and white families lived in close proximity, informal support networks developed. Celeste explained further, a white family might lose a mother in childbirth, leaving a father unable to care for multiple children while working. A black family in the same building or on the same block, having just lost a child to disease or accident, might informally take in one of those children. Or reverse the situation, a black family facing crisis might place a child with white neighbors who could provide care. These arrangements weren't official. They weren't legally recognized. They certainly weren't celebrated or documented in mainstream historical records. But they were documented here, Jonathan said, gesturing to the photograph. Someone wanted evidence that this family configuration existed. Over the following weeks, Jonathan and Celeste worked together, cross-referencing the photograph with city directories, church records, and census data from 1920 Baltimore. They focused on the three potential Parker/Barker Street addresses Jonathan had identified. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Celeste discovered a reference in the records of a settlement house, a community center that provided social services to working-class neighborhoods. The 1919 to 1921 logbook from Harbor Settlement House mentioned a family that matched the potential configuration, the Kowalski household, Parker Street. Father Michael, factory worker. Daughter Helen, age 9. Ward James, age 7, colored child placed after his mother's death in 1918. Ward. Not son. Not adopted child. Ward, a term suggesting informal guardianship without legal adoption. Jonathan found Michael Kowalski in the 1920 census, living at 247, Parker Street in East Baltimore. Listed in his household, Helen Kowalski, daughter, age 9, white. James Mitchell, boarder, age 7, black. Boarder. The census taker had found a way to document James's presence in the household without acknowledging the true nature of the relationship, that this 7-year-old child was being raised as part of the Kowalski family. But where was the mother? Why did the photograph show two parents? Celeste found the answer in marriage records. Michael Kowalski had remarried in early 1920 to a woman named Catherine O'Brien, a widow herself. The photograph had likely been taken shortly after their marriage, a new family unit being formally documented. They discovered more details through settlement house records. James Mitchell's mother, Louise Mitchell, had worked in the same garment factory as Michael Kowalski. When Louise died during the influenza epidemic of 1918, leaving 7-year-old James orphaned, Michael had taken the boy into his household. Not temporarily. Not as a servant. As a child to be raised alongside his own daughter Helen. This wasn't charity in the traditional sense. According to the settlement house notes, Louise and Michael had been friends, co-workers who had helped each other through various hardships. When Louise died, Michael honored that friendship by caring for her son. But doing so in 1920 Baltimore was dangerous. Maryland had anti-miscegenation laws. While these laws primarily targeted marriage between races, any household arrangement that appeared to blur racial lines could attract hostile attention. Black children could not attend white schools. Housing segregation was intensifying. The Ku Klux Klan was experiencing a resurgence across America, including in Maryland. Taking this photograph was an act of defiance, Celeste said. Or maybe an act of desperate documentation. If something happened to Michael, if authorities questioned the arrangement, this photograph proved James belonged to this family, even if no law recognized it. Jonathan contacted the Maryland State Archives, searching for any trace of what happened to this family after 1920. He found Michael Kowalski in city directories through 1925, still at the Parker Street address, still listed as a factory worker. Then the trail went cold. Census records from 1930 showed Helen Kowalski, now 19, living in a different Baltimore neighborhood, working as a shop clerk, living alone. No mention of James Mitchell. No mention of her father or stepmother. Jonathan wondered if the arrangement had been broken, if social pressure or legal intervention had forced the family apart. But then Celeste made another discovery. In the records of Mother Mary Lang Catholic School, a historically black school in Baltimore, she found enrollment information for James Mitchell, covering the years 1921 through 1927. The person paying his tuition and listed as guardian, Michael Kowalski. He kept him, Jonathan said, amazed. Even though it meant paying for private school, even though it meant maintaining this arrangement that could have brought him trouble, he kept raising this child. They found James Mitchell again in the 1930 census, age 17, living in Baltimore, working as an apprentice carpenter. His race was listed as Negro, but his residence was given as the same address where Michael Kowalski lived. The arrangement had continued for at least a decade. Celeste put out a call through genealogy networks and historical societies, looking for any descendants of the Kowalski or Mitchell families. 3 months later, she received a response. A woman named Patricia Gardner, living in Silver Spring, Maryland, reached out. She was the granddaughter of Helen Kowalski, who had died in 1982. Patricia had boxes of her grandmother's belongings, including photographs and letters. Jonathan and Celeste drove to Silver Spring the following week. Patricia welcomed them into her home and brought out a cardboard box filled with old photographs, documents, and a few letters. My grandmother rarely talked about her childhood, Patricia explained. She said her family situation had been complicated, that people wouldn't understand. But when I was a teenager, she told me she'd had a brother growing up, though not by blood. She said he was the best brother anyone could have asked for. Inside the box was a photograph identical to the one Jonathan had been studying. On the back, in the same faded pencil, was more complete information: our family, 247, Parker Street, Baltimore, June 1920. Michael, Catherine, Helen, James. There were other photographs too. One showed 2 children, Helen and James, sitting on front steps, probably around 1922 based on their apparent ages. Another showed James as a teenager, standing with an older man who must have been Michael Kowalski, both in work clothes, apparently at a construction site. And there were letters. Helen had saved correspondence between herself and James after she moved out in the late 1920s. The letters revealed a relationship that had endured despite the challenges. In one letter dated 1931, James wrote to Helen, "I know our situation was unusual. I know people questioned why your father took me in, why he kept me all those years. But he gave me a life when I had lost everything. He never treated me differently than you. We were both his children, even if the world said that was impossible. I'll be grateful forever." Helen's response, also preserved, was equally moving: "You were my brother. You are my brother. Nothing else matters. Papa did what was right, even when it was hard. I'm proud of him for that. I'm proud of us." Jonathan and Celeste worked with Patricia to piece together the rest of the story. James Mitchell had become a successful carpenter, married in 1935, and had 3 children. He stayed in Baltimore his entire life, working in construction and eventually running his own small contracting business. He died in 1973 at age 60. Michael Kowalski had died in 1938, still living at the Parker Street address. James had attended the funeral, though census and city directory records suggested he was no longer living in Michael's household by then. He would have been 25 years old in 1938, an adult with his own life. But the funeral records from St. Vincent's Catholic Church listed James Mitchell among the deceased's immediate family, Michael Kowalski, survived by daughter Helen Kowalski Wagner and ward James Mitchell. Even in death, the formal record acknowledged the relationship while finding a term, ward, that avoided calling it what it truly was, father and son. Patricia connected Jonathan and Celeste with James Mitchell's grandson, a man named Marcus Mitchell who lived in West Baltimore. Marcus, age 48, worked as a high school history teacher. He knew fragments of his grandfather's story but had never understood the full context. Grandfather James talked about being raised by a white family, Marcus explained when they met. He said it was complicated, that the 1920s weren't a time when people understood families like his. He said a man named Michael Kowalski saved his life, gave him opportunities he never would have had otherwise. But he also said there was pain in it, always being the different one, always having to explain, always existing in this space that society said shouldn't exist. Marcus had his own photographs, including one of James as an older man in the 1960s, standing with a white woman whom Marcus identified as Helen, Michael Kowalski's daughter. Despite decades and marriages and separate lives, they had remained in contact, had maintained the sibling bond formed in that Parker Street house a lifetime earlier. Jonathan organized a small exhibition at the Baltimore Museum focused on unconventional family structures in early 20th century working-class neighborhoods. The photograph of Michael, Catherine, Helen, and James became the centerpiece, displayed alongside the documentation that explained their story, settlement house records, census data, the letters between Helen and James, testimony from their descendants. The exhibition was titled Families Beyond Boundaries, Hidden Histories of Care and Kinship. It drew steady crowds and significant media attention. Local news outlets covered it. National historians reached out with similar examples they'd encountered, fragments of evidence suggesting that despite rigid segregation and racial hostility, some working-class communities maintained pockets of practical cooperation that crossed racial lines. Other families came forward with their own stories. A woman brought in a photograph of her Italian immigrant grandparents who had raised a black neighbor's child after both parents died in an industrial accident in 1923. A man shared documents showing his black great-grandmother had informally cared for the children of a white widow on her block in the 1910s, a relationship that had continued for years until the widow remarried. These arrangements had existed in the gaps of official history. They weren't legal. They weren't sanctioned. They often weren't even spoken about openly. But they happened, driven by economic necessity, personal relationships, and simple human compassion that occasionally managed to overcome the era's rigid racial barriers. The photograph from Parker Street stood as rare documentation of something that was supposed to be impossible in 1920s America, a family that crossed racial lines, held together not by law or social acceptance but by choice and commitment and love. Patricia Gardner and Marcus Mitchell met for the first time at the exhibition opening. Two people whose grandparents had been raised as siblings, now connected across a century by a photograph that had almost been lost to history. My grandmother Helen always said family was about who showed up for you, who stayed when things were hard, Patricia told Marcus. Your grandfather was family to her. That's what matters. My grandfather never forgot Michael Kowalski, Marcus replied. He told my father that Michael gave him a chance at life, treated him with dignity when the world said he didn't deserve it. That's legacy. That's what we should remember. The photograph remained on display in the museum's permanent collection. School groups came to see it, learning about this hidden aspect of American history, the moments of connection and care that existed despite systemic racism and segregation, the families that formed in defiance of social expectations, the love that persisted even when law and custom said it shouldn't exist. Sometimes history's greatest mysteries are solved not through dramatic discoveries but through patient research, careful documentation, and the willingness to believe that people in the past were as complicated, as compassionate, and as capable of transcending boundaries as people today. Sometimes you just need to look past the surface of a photograph to see the extraordinary courage it represents, a family that refused to be defined by the limitations of their time, documented for posterity in a single image from a modest home on Parker Street in 1920.